Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Canon Powershot G1X, the original G1X from like over a decade ago at this point, since 2012. But it is a very nice camera. It's actually my favorite compact camera to use. It's very solidly built. The image quality is great in my opinion. I really love it, and also just all the controls, all the feeling of this camera, all the finishing on this camera. It's just a very nice and enjoyable camera to use. It is also like semi-big, but it's not too big that it's not really portable. So yeah, I really love the overall design. I really love a lot of things, and yes, judging from the tone, I think you all already know how I think about this camera. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon Powershot G1X, now this camera being released way back in 2012, it's over a decade old at this point, but it is, in my opinion, still a very capable camera to use, and the one that actually will deliver really great results as well, depending on what you do, and also if you actually know what you're doing as well. It is a camera that allows you to do a lot of manual controls with this camera, which is actually very nice, and the feeling of this camera is just, you know, it's a very nice feeling camera to hold and operate as well. It does have some of the negative points that I don't like about this camera, or I wish it had, so I'll also be talking about that later in the video as well. And as usual, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections. The first one will be usability and the ergonomics, and then following by the image quality for both photography and video, and then followed by my conclusion. So let's first start with the usability and the ergonomics. Well, as I mentioned before, this camera actually feels very nice, very solid in your hand. It doesn't feel like it's a camera that would break down very easily, and of course, being a camera that's already this old, it actually proved through time and time again that it's actually a very solidly built camera. The hinges and everything still feels very stiff, very nice, albeit with a lot of dust in between, because, you know, it's been taken through so many storms, through so many weather conditions, through so many places, but it is still overall a very nice and tough, rugged camera to take with you. It is not officially weather sealed, but I've worked with it in like light drizzle, light rain condition, although I don't condone it, but it actually survived based on my user experience with it. And also what I really love about this camera is that unlike other bigger sensor compact cameras, the dust doesn't get onto the sensor very easily through the lens. Because for example, with the Alex100, it also has a big sensor, but the dust just gets through the lens very, very easily, whereas this camera, it just does a very good job of actually blocking the dust from entering through the lens onto the sensor itself, because obviously it's not an interchangeable lens system, so you can't actually just unmount the lens easily to just clean the sensor. You actually would have to, you know, open up the lens itself and then clean the sensor, and assuming you can actually get the lens assembled back together onto the body, then that's pretty much the only way you can actually clean the sensor. But this camera just has a very nice and tight seal to it, that the dust doesn't get onto the sensor that easily. Moving on to the next point, this camera has a very nice and logical layout of buttons that I really like. Everything feels very solid, very nice as well. Very tactile. If you're working with thick gloves in winter, you will definitely be able to, you know that you're pressing on the buttons and, you know, working with the buttons. The only gripe about the button layout on this particular camera is if you're working with thick gloves or if you have really, really big hands. I really don't like the wheel on the back here, because the wheel here is just, you know, a bit flimsy in my opinion, and you can actually rotate it actually very easily. There is a bit of travel to it, so you're not really going to accidentally press on the wheel to navigate through different functions that easily, but at the same time you can rotate it quite easily. So that's the only gripe I have about this camera, well, when it comes to the button layout and designs. But otherwise, everything has a very nice resistance to it. You're not going to be accidentally, you know, knocking the dials up here, or the mode dial as well, knocking the lever by accident, the zoom lever that is, or accidentally pressing on the shutter button. And now moving on to the next point, which is the lens. The lens on here is a standard 28 to 112 millimeter full frame equivalent focal length. The only downside, well, there are several downsides about this lens that I find, is that I wish that it would actually start a bit wider, like let's say 24, because I think that, you know, if you're going to use this lens professionally, this camera professionally, a 24 millimeter would actually be much more useful. Maybe cut it down to 100 millimeter at the telephoto end or even 70mm, because at the end of the day, a 24 to 70 would be more useful, in my opinion, than a 28 to 112mm focal range. Of course, it might make the lens a bit bigger and, you know, a bit more front heavy, things like that. But at the end of the day, it would actually make this camera much more useful and also practical to a lot of the target audience or target clients that Canon was aiming at, which were, you know, semi-professional photographers to like professional photographers who were already relying a lot on their DSLRs and just want to have their compact that produces DSLR-like quality images. And another downside about the lens is that the aperture range, it only goes from f2.8 to 5.8, and that is a very, very dark lens for me. And especially when I was just talking about, you know, this camera in the previous video, the Canon Powershot G16, when the lens on this camera goes between f1.8 and f2.8, which is much brighter. Of course, the sensor is much smaller on this camera, but in the same time, it just has a much brighter lens to work with, which will actually be much more beneficial, especially in low light situations. So I just wish that this camera would have, you know, a brighter lens and also a wider lens as well. Another downside what I find about this camera is the ISO range. It starts from ISO 100 and it expands all the way to ISO 12,800. That being said, I wish that the ISO range would maybe start at 50 or at least at 80, because, you know, I always like cleaner images, especially coming from a compact camera, because I find that, you know, this camera, although able to produce really clean results, even up to ISO 800, but in the same time, it is a little bit limiting if, let's say, if I want to shoot in direct bright sunlight, or if I just want to, let's say, have a cleaner image than ISO 100. Because, for example, with the G16, I was able to get much cleaner results with ISO 80 than ISO 100. So yeah, I just wish that this would actually go down to below 100 as well. But anyway, it is what it is. So it is still a very good option to have. And the shutter speed actually goes up to 4,000th of a second. So it's actually quite standard. I wish that it would actually go up to 8,000th of a second though, because, you know, it's a more professional kind of camera, and, you know, 4,000th of a second is kind of a standard. And especially at the time when you actually paid more to get this camera over the G16, I think having an 8,000th of a second is not too much to ask for. Especially at that time, a lot of semi-professional cameras at that price also goes up to 8,000th of a second as well. Whew. So yeah, a lot of things I do wish, but in the same time, it is still a great camera after all. And moving on to a nicer aspect of this camera is the screen. The screen has a very nice stiffness to it. It's also very nicely built, and it's a screen that you can actually rely on in terms of the contrast, brightness, the exposure and everything, because yeah, it's still a very sharp enough screen to actually operate, and also the screen that you can still judge your image, your composition, your color, your contrast and everything with. Unlike some of the other screen from the much earlier cameras, you know, sometimes the contrast is a little bit off, sometimes the sharpness is a little bit off, you're not sure if the image is really as sharp as you want, but in the same time with the screen you can really judge a lot of that. But in the same time, I've been using that phrase for quite some time now, but anyway, in the same time, if you're actually viewing the screen in such a bright sunlight or brightly lit condition, then you might actually find yourself shielding the screen a little bit, because it's a little bit too reflective and also not bright enough to fight against, let's say, a midsummer day sunlight situation. So just keep that in mind. But moving on to the next point, I really like the viewfinder here. It is not a true optical viewfinder. It's just seeing what this window is seeing, but it actually does zoom in when you do zoom with the lens, which is good. And there's the diopter. You can actually adjust the eyesight through here, which is actually quite nice. And yeah, overall it's just a very nice design camera. Everything's very well put together, very tactile, very solidly feel. The software inside is also pretty good. So the menu system, just like any other Canon menu system, it's very efficiently organized and also very nicely laid out as well. You can access through the different functions, different settings very easily and very quickly. All the names and everything also logically named, unlike some other brands like Sony. But yeah, everything is just very very easily accessible and also conveniently placed onto this camera. And even the quick menu within the live view screen, it's also very nicely put together. Everything is just very quickly accessible and also very efficiently organized as well. So that is something that I really love using with this camera, because, you know, I want a camera that I can just, you know, use and just take pictures right away and access everything within my, like, the tip of my fingers. And also just, you know, a camera that I don't have to worry too much about when it comes to settings, when it comes to like me working on, you know, in the field or just taking pictures here and there. I just don't want to be bothered by thinking about where that settings in the menu is, where the settings in this function of the menu is, things like that. I just want to be, you know, operating this camera seamlessly and also just effortlessly with, you know, working with this camera and just capture the moment, capture the shots. And this camera really allows me to do that, which is actually quite nice. On to the next point, this camera is able to shoot RAW, which is great. Of course, as expected, because even the G1, the original G1 right here, it does able to shoot RAW as well, which is nice. But this camera obviously being a much higher level camera, not being able to shoot RAW would actually have been a disaster. But this camera allows you to actually shoot in RAW, which is quite nice. And it's been a setting that I've been keeping on this camera since. This camera can only shoot up to 1.9 frames per second, which is of course a lot less than, let's say, the 12 point something frames per second on the G16, and also down to like 9 point something frames per second after the buffer got slower on the G16. Of course, it's not as fast as that, but in the same time, it is a much bigger sensor than the G16. Just keep that in mind. I just wish it does go a little bit faster, maybe like at least 3.5 frames per second. That would actually have been nice and more of a standard frames per second for this price range and this compact camera at the time, at least. So yeah, but you can't always get everything. But where is really good is you can actually rely a lot on the auto white balance. So what Canon has been getting really right is since 2010 at least, with their auto white balance system, it's always been very accurate, very nice, and this camera is no exception either. This camera has a very nice auto white balance system where it actually in most scenarios would be able to predict the auto white balance quite accurately as well. And if you're shooting in RAW, you can always tweak the white balance to your liking or to even more an accurate point that you feel that the image should actually reach to. Now this camera also has a very nice battery life to it, because I've been using the same battery for like weeks now and still haven't, you know, really changed it, and it's still like on its last bar. But in the same time, it's a very nice and solid battery, and the one that you can actually find still brand new in the market, because it's very common battery. You'd find it in quite a few other camera models as well from Canon. Oh, and also the battery compartment is down here together with the SD card, which is kind of a bummer, especially from a semi-professional or like a professional compact camera. I think that it would have been much nicer if the tripod mount would actually be in the center here, at least, so that you can access the battery and the card compartment much easier. Now, I don't do a lot of long exposure with this camera, but if you're a type of person who do a lot of long exposure photography with compact cameras, that can be a little bit of a hassle, because the tripod mount is just right there, right next to the actual compartments where it houses the SD card and the battery slot. And yeah, it's just a little bit cumbersome. But otherwise, if you're just setting this camera onto the tripod the whole time, what you can do is just put in a dummy battery and then just have the cord coming out on the side, and then there you can actually have like an unlimited amount of power until you of course pull the plug that there's no more power into the camera. So you can actually do that, and this camera actually allows you to do that, so that's actually quite nice. And moving on to the side, this camera actually has really nice ports that I personally don't use, but I'm really jealous of. For example, the HDMI port is a much bigger HDMI port than what I find on my R5 and R6 with a micro HDMI. I just wish that at least the R5 and R6 would have this HDMI port, but it doesn't. Anyway, it also has a very nice remote port above the HDMI port, and then also the USB port, which is good for, you know, transferring images, but in the same time you can just transfer with the SD card. The only thing I wish that this camera would have is the Wi-Fi feature, because then that way it would actually be much easier to just wirelessly transfer the images from this camera onto the phone and then just edit from the phone or other mobile devices and just share it from there, whether it's to your family, friends, or social media or what have you. So yeah, that's the real downside of this camera. But otherwise, this camera has a lot of features that a normal DSLR would, and also, yeah, the ports that a normal DSLR would, especially if you want to do like time-lapse photography with the intervalometer, or if you just want to do some quick landscape photography that you have to do some long exposure with and you use a remote control, you have that feature with this camera right here, so that's actually pretty good. Oh, and actually going on to the front for a little bit, there's the AF SS beam right here, which is actually pretty useful, I find, and also one that is actually not too blinding in my opinion. And here around the lens you can actually add extra accessories by just pressing on this particular button, like a little lever right there. It's a bit rough, but yeah, you can actually take out this ring and just mount accessories onto this camera, whether it's be like, you know, a telephoto lens or an ultra wide angle lens or a lens hood even. So yeah, well, a different kind of fancy lens hood that is, and other accessories that, you know, at the time many third-party brands also made for this particular camera, so you can still enjoy those today if you find them. And now moving on to the top, this camera has a very nice neatly hidden flash up here, which is also pretty nice because it raises up a bit further and away from the lens. So if you do shoot a lot of portrait, especially at night, having a flash that is a bit higher and further away from the lens help to actually reduce red eye effect. So that's actually pretty nice to see on this camera as well. The onboard preamp on this camera is not good if you're doing video, so don't trust too much. That being said, it doesn't actually allow you to plug in a mic onto this camera, so there's that. You just have to live with that. But yeah, otherwise, in terms of just being a nice photography camera, it is a nice photography camera at its core. And now let me actually go into the image quality. The image quality of this camera is actually quite nice. I really love the rollout into the shadows and highlights. It's actually very smooth and very natural. Of course, being an old compact camera, even though it was kind of professional compact camera at the time, it does have limitations. For example, the dynamic range isn't as good, especially comparing to the more modern day standards of, you know, the dynamic range on compact cameras. This camera cannot really beat them, but in the same time, the color science out of this camera is very nice. The skin tones, the color reproduction, the color depth is also pretty good on this camera. I really love it a lot. The sharpness out of this camera is actually pretty okay. You can actually tweak the files quite a bit because the file is actually quite robust coming out of this camera. Of course, I wouldn't recommend pulling a lot of shadows because that's where you'll start seeing a lot of noise. That being said, because it has such a big sensor in this camera, you can actually pull off quite a bit of highlights out of this sensor, and also the files are actually quite robust as well to a certain extent. And of course, the things to watch out for, just as many of the older cameras, is moire and aliasing. If you're photographing a lot of fine patterns, super fine pattern details, things like that, you might want to be careful with moire and aliasing because it is going to be showing up at least a little bit on this camera. It does do a good job of trying to eliminate a lot of moire and aliasing, but it only has so much capability, and with the older technology, it can only prevent it so much. So just watch out, you know, for the patterns that you're actually photographing as well. The 14 megapixel on this particular sensor will also allow you to really produce some really nice images. Not only that the sensor is big, but the 14 megapixel sensor on this camera will also allow you to actually produce some really fine prints, and also you can really see a lot of details. And if you want to do a little bit of cropping, you still can, because at the end of the day, if you just want to put this images up on your social media, 14 megapixels is definitely more than enough. If you think that 4K is such a huge resolution, it's technically only really around 8 megapixels. So if you like 4K, then 14 megapixels should be really good enough for you guys. And even if you crop it down to 10 or 8 megapixels, it's still more than enough resolution to play with, and also do some A4, A3, A2 prints with it as well. So yeah, and I'm talking about like fine prints. So yeah, it's still quite a powerful sensor coming out of this camera. Whew. But yeah, otherwise, as mentioned earlier, the skin tones, the color science, the color depth out of this camera is quite nice. You can actually manipulate it a little bit, and you can actually do some semi-professional job with this camera as well, depending on the area of photography you're actually focusing on. The raw files out of this camera is still quite nice to work with, even kind of semi-professionally speaking. So yeah, there's that. And now let me actually lead into the video side of things. The video side of things, well, this camera is very basic when it comes to video. It does 1080p from 2012. So of course it's not going to be like as sharp or as detailed as 1080p from, you know, today's standards. But at the end of the day, it will actually get the job done, because if you just need to take some snippets here, take some clips there, documents here and there, it will actually get the job done. The video files are actually detailed enough and a little bit more robust than, let's say, the G16's video files. But in the same time, it's not too much to really brag about, and it's not too much to really boast about either, simply because it's a very standard 1080p file and there is no slow motion on this camera. So yeah, take it for what it is. It will be able to actually deliver really nice rollouts into the highlights and shadows as well. So it's going to be very natural. And what I said pretty much about photography kind of also applies in video a little bit as well, because the color science is very nice out of this camera, and also it works very well with that IS on the sensor as well. And also, yeah, the autofocusing system in the video is actually not so good. It's hit and miss, but you can definitely make it work as well. The only thing I wish it has is, you know, a dedicated like manual control button for the focusing system that can actually manual control it yourself, like the original G1, that you can actually do manual focus on that camera as well. Whereas with this, there's no dedicated buttons for it. So yeah, that's a downer. But in the same time, a lot of the flaws that you find in photography mode will actually be a bit more pronounced in video. For example, with the moire and aliasing, it's definitely going to be a bit more pronounced in here. With a dynamic range, it's also going to be a bit more pronounced in here, that the dynamic range is not as good because the file is already pretty much baked and very compressed 1080p file, compared to, like, let's say with the photography side of things, where you actually have a raw file to actually, you know, gain a bit more detail back, just recover a bit more details back. But with video, it's a bit more compressed. But yeah, just take it for what it is. If you're just looking for a nice, reliable, old digital camera that actually gives you that older digital look, yet being a very nice and capable camera to really work with and take some snippets here and snippets there with, then this camera is still a nice camera to consider, especially at its price point nowadays, because it has a much bigger sensor than typical compact cameras would, and it also has a lot of manual settings, manual controls, and a lot of controls are nicely placed at your fingertips. The build quality is really nice. You can really get a lot of things done with this camera, whether through photography or video. And as I'm already hinting into the conclusion, let me just go into the conclusion. So yeah, the Canon Powershot G1X. This camera is still my favorite compact camera to work with, even though there are a lot of flaws and a lot of quirks that I really don't like about this camera, like, you know, having a very dark lens, and also having the ISO starting out at 100, and also not having Wi-Fi feature. But a lot of those things are just very minor, even though it's a lot of things piled up. For example, the 1.9 frames per second, it's really kind of a joke on this particular class of camera, especially considering the price range that and also like when it came out at the time. So yeah, it's a very slow camera. The autofocusing system is not that great. It is accurate when it is, but in most situations it's not going to be able to keep up with like basic activities, so you cannot really track a lot of movement with this autofocusing system, but you can actually get things very accurately focus on if the things are mostly stationary or just moving ever so slightly. So yeah, there is that. But otherwise, it's a very fun camera to use, as I've been repeating so many times. With the manual controls that it actually delivers, the design of this camera is also very nice. It's not too small, it's not too big, and the grip is really nice to hold. It is not weather sealed, but the build quality is also very tough enough for me to actually take into like light dusty environments, light rain situations, things like that, and actually survived. So yeah, it's actually a very nice camera to really take with me, and also it's a very nice refreshment to actually have in my hands when, you know, I'm already working with the R5, R6, the original R, and the A7 IV that's filming me right now, and just like sometimes get away from those cameras and just focus on the basics, and also focus on getting different perspective with this camera, because with this camera being a compact camera, it does limit certain things, but in the same time it does limit it in a way that helps me to be more creative and just freshen up my mind a little bit more. So yeah, that's also very good. And sometimes it's also just very good to just have a nice light small camera like this one to just, you know, carry around and just take pictures here and take pictures there with, and also just, you know, come home with still a very nice and robust file that you can actually work with, do some very fine prints with as well. And also the zoom on this particular camera is also very nice. It's very smooth. It's not the fastest zoom out there. I think some of the other G series can actually zoom much faster than this can, but in the same time, if you're doing video work, the zoom on here is actually very nice and smooth enough so that you can actually get some smooth zoom with this camera. But yeah, otherwise, I think I've pretty much mentioned all of the main points that I wanted to highlight. Yes, there are a lot of features on this camera that I really haven't covered yet, but in the same time, I just wanted to share with you guys my thoughts and opinion on this camera based on how I shoot with it, and also, yeah, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, in case it might actually help some of you guys out. And I hope you can actually gain something from this video. If you do need a free photography guidebook, the link is down in the description section below. It's absolutely for free on my website. Just click and download, and it will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense, and you don't need to submit your email address or anything. Just really click and download. It's absolutely for free. If you have any questions, any suggestions, any stories you want to share, also feel free to just put them down in the comment section below as well. I'll do my best to get to you guys and reply to them. Otherwise, I thank you all very much for sticking in this video this long, and also for watching. Thank you guys very much. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.